She slapped him across the face, and seconds later, he kissed her, after 7 years of silence, loyalty, and swallowing her pride. Grace Whitmore finally snapped. Her boss, Daniel Prescott, had humiliated her in front of a room full of partners, and she slapped him. What she didn't expect was what came next. A kiss, no words, no apology. Just a moment that made no sense and yet somehow explained everything, because Daniel wasn't just her boss. He was also the man whose company had destroyed her father's dreams years before she ever sat outside his office door. So now tell me, what would you do if you gave a man your trust, only to find out he once took everything from you? Would you walk away? Would you demand answers? Or would you dare stay long enough to listen? This is a story about how two wounds met, about the fire that broke them, and the quiet that saved them, and about how sometimes the loudest healing begins with a slap. If this moment gripped you, tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Grace's place? Now, let's begin with the slap that changed everything. Grace Whitmore had never raised her voice at work, let alone her hand, but in that moment, after 7 years of loyal service, all it took was one sentence from Daniel Prescott to shatter her restraint. She didn't remember her hand moving, only the sound it made, the sharp, unmistakable crack that seemed to slice through the silence like a lightning bolt through dry air. It wasn't rage that drove her. It was something deeper, a breaking point, a quiet snap after years of pushing down what she truly felt. 7 years. That's how long she'd been Daniel's executive assistant. Not a day late. Not a word out of place. Not a boundary crossed. Grace had never planned to stay that long. After her engagement ended suddenly, cruelly, she had simply wanted a job that made her feel useful again. Something that gave her back a sense of order after her personal life had unraveled without warning. What began as a 1-year contract turned into something far more complicated. Not because Daniel Prescott was charming. He wasn't. He was cold, distant, brilliant. Yes, but not easy, not warm. But he was consistent, and after the chaos of betrayal, Grace had found quiet comfort in his predictability. She admired his focus, his discipline, the way he built things that lasted: bridges, housing projects, entire neighborhoods, while the rest of the world chased temporary wins. She thought maybe, just maybe, she was building something of her own too. That illusion ended at 10:17 a.m. in a cedar-scented conference room at Blue Ridge Resort. Outside, autumn leaves blazed in golden brilliance. Inside, Grace stood before a room of board members and regional partners, her palms only lightly trembling as she presented a project close to her heart. She had worked on it quietly for months, gathering data, running projections, even visiting rural towns on weekends to speak with struggling single mothers in aging apartments. Her proposal wasn't just another development plan. It was personal. It was meaningful. It was hers. She clicked to the final slide, her voice steady, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I believe we have a chance," she said, "to build something that truly changes lives without sacrificing profitability." For a breathless moment, there was stillness. One of the senior partners leaned forward. Someone even murmured, "Impressive." And then Daniel's voice cut through the air like ice. "Thank you, Grace. We'll table that for internal review. Let's move on to Denver zoning." Just like that. No questions, no support, no acknowledgement of the effort she had poured in. The room shifted. The energy dimmed. Heads turned back to spreadsheets. Grace felt like a painting being rolled up and put away. She sat down quietly. Her hands were cold. After the meeting, she waited. She waited until the last briefcase clicked shut, until the polite nods and goodbyes faded down the hall. Then she rose, She didn't knock on his door. She had never walked into his office uninvited before, but today, something inside her had shifted. Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the woods. His suit jacket was draped over the back of his chair. His sleeves were rolled just above the wrist. That was rare. That meant the meeting had drained him, too. But Grace didn't care. "You silenced me," she said. He turned but didn't look surprised to see her. "It wasn't the right time." "It was never the right time," she said, stepping closer. "But I made time. I prepared. I gave everything I had to that presentation, and you shut it down, without blinking." His voice didn't rise. It never did. "You're not here to dream, Grace. You're here to assist." That was the sentence. Not shouted, not cruel on the surface, but it struck like a blade. She felt her hand move before she decided to move it, felt the sting in her palm, the shock in the air. He didn't react at first, just blinked. His jaw twitched slightly, not in anger but something else. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. And then he stepped toward her, not with fury, with something darker, more vulnerable. His eyes held hers still, silent, unreadable. Then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was full of tension, grief, electricity, all the things they had never said in 7 years. His hands didn't grab or press. He simply leaned in, just enough for her lips to meet his. And then it ended. He pulled back. His breath was steady, his expression unreadable. Grace didn't speak. Couldn't. Daniel turned, reached for his jacket, and walked out, leaving the door half open behind him. She remained rooted to the floor, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of confusion. What just happened? Not just the kiss, not just the slap, but the years of unspoken glances, the late nights spent in the same quiet office, him reviewing plans, her booking flights, the small ways they had grown used to each other, depended on each other, trusted each other. Had she imagined it all, or had this been simmering under the surface, just waiting for one crack in the dam? She touched her lips, still tingling from the shock. No one else had ever kissed her like that. Not since the man who left her at the altar 3 weeks before the wedding. Not since she promised herself she would never let anyone get that close again. And yet, here she was, her world shaken, her silence broken. That night, neither of them slept, for very different reasons. The hand that slapped her boss still tingled, but it wasn't regret. It was the aftershock of feeling something she hadn't felt in years, power. Grace Whitmore wasn't used to power, not the kind that rose up from the gut, uninvited and unapologetic. She was used to control, lists, order, being needed but not seen. Her power had always been the quiet kind, like setting a room just right before anyone arrived. But that slap, it came from somewhere deeper, somewhere older. For hours afterward, she replayed it in her mind, the look in Daniel's eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way the air shifted before he stepped forward and kissed her. That kiss. God help her, that kiss. It wasn't sweet. It wasn't careful. It wasn't meant to be either. It was like someone breaking a seal. Now, sitting alone in her hotel room as daylight faded beyond the pine trees, Grace stared at the half-packed suitcase on her bed. The zipper was stuck. The shirts were wrinkled. Nothing felt right. Her phone buzzed once, then stopped. A calendar reminder. She didn't check it. Instead, she lay back on the bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan spinning slowly above her, and let her mind drift back to another room, another silence. The church had been small, white pews, pale blue hydrangeas. She remembered how cold her hands had felt, even in summer. Her bridesmaids had joked that she needed champagne. Instead, she sipped water and looked at the clock. When her mother entered the dressing room with that look on her face, that gentle, crumbling look, Grace knew. She didn't even need the words. He wasn't coming. No call, no explanation, just a decision made in silence. That day, something in her had folded in on itself. Not broken, exactly, just buried. She'd packed her dress away that night without crying. She gave the flowers to the church staff. She mailed back the ring. And then she got a job where nothing was left to chance. A job with Daniel Prescott. In 7 years, he never asked about her past, never flirted, never crossed the line. They were efficient, unemotional, polished, until yesterday. Grace sat up slowly, brushing a wrinkle from her skirt. She should feel ashamed. She had slapped her boss, kissed him, or let him kiss her. It was wrong. It was wildly unprofessional, and yet she didn't regret it. That was the strange part. She felt something else instead, a kind of trembling clarity, like a fog lifting. For years, she'd convinced herself she was safe inside her silence, that if she didn't ask for anything, she couldn't lose anything. But now, her body felt like it remembered something her mind had tried to forget, that she had desires, boundaries, fire, and Daniel had seen it, which might explain why he hadn't spoken to her since. They had flown back to Chicago on the same private jet, seated 5 feet apart and a universe away. Daniel spent the entire flight buried in his tablet, eyes locked on blueprints that he didn't flip. Grace, for her part, had stared out the window and memorized clouds. It had been 6 days since they landed. 6 days of awkward hallway passes. 6 days of no texts, no meetings, no accidental coffee breaks. He was avoiding her. She could feel it in the subtle shifts, the way his door stayed shut, the way he used a different assistant to handle logistics for an upcoming project. It shouldn't hurt. It wasn't like they were anything. But it did, because now she didn't know what she was to him, what he was to her. A boss. A man who'd kissed her in a moment of weakness, a ghost she worked beside, or worse, a mistake. She reached for the notebook on her nightstand, flipping past pages of grocery lists, meeting notes, ideas she'd scribbled late at night. Near the back, she found a line she'd written nearly a year ago, one she'd forgotten. To be quiet is not the same as to be invisible. Grace traced the words with her finger. She had made herself invisible for so long, out of self-protection, out of pride. But now the silence didn't feel safe anymore. It felt suffocating. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it didn't stop. She glanced at the screen. Daniel Prescott. Her thumb hovered over the green button. Her heart pounded not with fear, but with weight, with meaning. When his name lit up her phone screen, she almost didn't pick up. It was supposed to be just another site visit until the GPS failed, until the road vanished, until they were left with nothing but trees, silence, and unresolved tension. Grace hadn't wanted to be in the same car with him, not after what happened, not after the way he kissed her, and then left her standing there with her heart pounding and her mind spiraling. But the Appalachia project needed someone senior. Daniel insisted, and she agreed. Maybe out of professionalism, maybe out of curiosity, maybe because some part of her still wanted answers. They left early, driving into the hills before the sun had risen fully over Chicago. Autumn had turned the trees to fire reds and golds, lighting the narrow roads. It should have been beautiful, should have felt peaceful. Instead, the tension sat thick between them. Daniel drove. Grace watched the map. They spoke only when necessary, and even then, it was all about logistics, acreage, construction permits, Drainage concerns, like the slap and the kiss and the silence of the last week, had never happened. The paved roads narrowed to gravel. Gravel turned to dirt. The GPS lost signal. Then the engine sputtered. Daniel frowned and glanced at the dashboard. That can't be right, but it was. The SUV coasted for another 20 yards before dying completely on a desolate trail lined with trees. No signs in sight. Grace looked at her phone. No service. Of course. Daniel popped the hood, checked the fuel gauge, and exhaled in disbelief. We're out. She raised an eyebrow. I thought these were company cars. Don't they fuel themselves? Apparently, not this one. A long pause. Then, great. Neither of them said anything for a while. The quiet wasn't comfortable, but it also wasn't new. Grace stepped out and took in their surroundings, towering trees, filtered sunlight, the earthy scent of pine and damp leaves. Somewhere nearby, a woodpecker tapped out its rhythm. The world was still and alive all at once. Daniel motioned toward a faint path leading into the woods. We can't stay in the car. Let's see where that goes. She hesitated. And if it doesn't go anywhere, then we come back and wait. She followed, arms crossed, boots crunching leaves behind him. The path wound gently uphill. After 10 or 15 minutes, they came upon a clearing and a weathered wooden structure, half hidden by brush and thyme. A small sign swung above the doorway, Fire Tower Station Number 12. It looked abandoned, but intact. Daniel tried the door. It opened with a long, creaking groan. Inside, the air was musty with dust and old ash. A table sat in the center. A rusted stove leaned in the corner. There was a stone fireplace and a wooden bench along the wall. No power, no running water, but it was shelter. Grace stepped inside slowly, brushing cobwebs from the window frame. The place smelled like wet leaves and memory. She pulled her coat tighter. It'll do. Daniel nodded. I'll find wood. She didn't argue, didn't offer to help. Instead, she set about sweeping the floor with the edge of her boot, clearing space near the fireplace. It wasn't until later, when the sun dipped low and the shadows deepened, that Daniel returned, arms full of branches and twigs. His jacket was smudged, his hair tousled by the wind. He didn't speak, just crouched by the hearth, stacking the wood in practiced layers. She watched him from the bench, her hands in her lap, her body still tense as if preparing for battle. The match flared in his fingers, then caught the kindling. Flames licked upward, casting soft gold against the cabin's dark walls. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was the crackle of fire, the breath of wind outside. Then Daniel sat back, his eyes reflecting the firelight. And he looked at her. Really looked. Was it really about me, he asked? The question hung in the air, quiet but sharp. He wasn't being defensive. He wasn't even accusing. He just wanted to know. And Grace. She didn't know how to answer. Not right away. Her gaze fell to the fire, to the way the flames consumed and revealed all at once. Was it about him? Yes and no. The slap had come from years of feeling dismissed, of being useful but never important, of men taking what they wanted, her time, her presence, her heart, and leaving her to sweep up the pieces. But Daniel wasn't like the others. He hadn't promised anything, hadn't pretended to care. He had simply been there, quiet, capable, closed off, until he wasn't. And now, she didn't know what scared her more, that the kiss meant something, or that it didn't. She drew in a breath. Grace stared into the fire, and for the first time began to answer. The fire crackled, casting shadows on the wooden walls. But it couldn't burn away the weight between them. Grace sat with her knees drawn close to her chest, arms wrapped around them for warmth. Though the fire glowed steadily in the hearth, her eyes didn't leave the flames, as if they held answers to questions she hadn't yet asked. Across the room, Daniel sat quietly on the floor, back resting against the wooden wall, hands loose on his knees. There was no desk between them, no meeting to organize, no agenda to follow. Just two people. And silence. It had been years since Grace had been this alone with a man, not physically, but emotionally. She could feel every second stretch between them, unfiltered, heavy, bare. He'd asked her a question before sunset, before the world fell dark. Was it really about me? And now the fire was waiting for her answer, too. She took a breath, slow and deliberate. I was engaged once, she began softly, the words almost a whisper. Daniel didn't move, just listened. He was kind, in the way people are when they want to be seen as kind. He was good on paper. He said the right things, held my hand when people were watching. But I think, deep down, I always knew he didn't really see me. She paused. The fire popped gently, sending a flicker of light across the floor. We set a date, booked the church, chose the menu. My dress was hanging in my closet the night before the rehearsal dinner. She looked at the fire, but saw something else. A mirror, a white dress, her mother dabbing at tears with a tissue. And then he left. 3 weeks before the wedding. No fight, no warning. He just said he couldn't do it. That I was too much. That he needed space to think. Daniel's jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't speak. I didn't cry at first. I just shut down, told everyone I was fine, that I'd bounce back. But the truth is, something in me broke that day. Not just my heart. My sense of being visible. She turned to him, voice steadier now. Do you know what it feels like to be beside someone who pretends you're seen but never really looks at you? Daniel's eyes met hers. Slowly, deeply. Yes, he said. And the way he said it made her inhale sharply. He shifted, drawing a little closer to the fire, the glow lighting the edges of his face. My wife's name was Elena, he said. We were married 12 years. She made everything bright, everything I wasn't. She had this way of turning an ordinary Wednesday into something worth remembering. Grace watched him, quiet. She was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring. She didn't even tell me right away. Didn't want to worry me. By the time she did, it had already spread. He swallowed hard, voice a little rougher now. I tried to save her, in the only way I knew how: appointments, second opinions, spreadsheets of clinical trials. But it wasn't something I could fix, and I think part of me hated that. He looked down at his hands. When she passed, I didn't cry. Not at the funeral. Not when I packed her things. I just worked. I buried myself in blueprints and meetings. I thought if I stopped moving, I'd fall apart. Grace leaned in a little, drawn to the rawness in his voice. You never talk about her, she said gently. I couldn't. He replied, not until now. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred, as if the space between them was holding something precious. Grace leaned back against the bench, exhaling slowly. I used to think if I made myself small enough, careful enough, no one could hurt me again. That if I followed the rules, I'd be respected, protected. But all it did was make me invisible. Daniel shifted closer, not touching her, just closing the space between their voices. You were never invisible, he said quietly. Grace's eyes found his in the firelight. Yes, I was, she whispered. Even with you." Daniel didn't argue. He just nodded, the truth of it settling into his shoulders. The fire burned lower now, the logs collapsing inward. Shadows danced higher on the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling through branches like soft footsteps circling the cabin. Grace yawned, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline of the day. She pulled her coat tighter, curling slightly on the worn bench. Her limbs ached. Her mind was heavy, but something inside her felt lighter. Daniel stood quietly, walked to the back of the room, and returned with an old wool blanket he'd found rolled up on a dusty shelf. He knelt beside her, gently covering her with it. She murmured something unintelligible, eyes half-lidded with sleep. And then, without thinking, he shrugged off his own jacket and draped it over her as well. He didn't touch her, didn't linger. He just sat down again by the fire, gaze flickering between the last glowing embers and the quiet rhythm of her breathing. He didn't sleep that night. He just watched her breathe. The morning sun brought no clarity, only silence. Grace stirred just as light filtered through the dusty cabin window, casting slanted gold across the floor. The fire had died down to embers. The blanket still lay over her shoulders, warm and unexpectedly comforting. Daniel was sitting in the same spot he'd been all night, back against the bench, eyes closed, but not asleep. He looked peaceful, at least on the outside, but Grace knew better than to believe stillness meant calm. They didn't speak as they packed up. The walk back to the road was quiet, just the sound of boots crunching frost and birdsong echoing above the trees. Daniel carried the dead phone. Grace carried the silence. They flagged down a local trucker who passed by mid-morning. By noon, they were at a diner in town, sipping weak coffee and avoiding eye contact. An hour later, they were on a rental car back to Chicago, back to meetings, back to normal. Or at least, the version of normal they both knew how to survive in. But something had shifted. Grace felt it in the way her office chair no longer fit quite right. In the way she paused before responding to emails, as if waiting for someone to interrupt her silence with meaning. She moved through the days with practiced grace, but now there was something soft and unsettled beneath the surface. Daniel didn't mention the night in the cabin, not the fire, not the blanket, not the questions or the stories or the weight they'd laid down just long enough to breathe. He became more formal than before, if that was possible. Emails instead of in-person updates. Meetings kept brief. Eye contact avoided. Grace told herself it didn't matter, told herself it was better this way. That night had been an anomaly, an outlier carved into the wilderness, but the problem with being seen, even once, is that it makes invisibility unbearable. She found herself watching him in meetings, noticing the tightness in his jaw when he disagreed with someone, the way he always straightened his cuffs before making a point. These were habits she'd cataloged long ago, but now they felt different. They weren't just details. They were fragments of a person she had almost begun to know. And in quieter moments, when she wasn't chasing deadlines or managing schedules, she let her thoughts wander back to the woods, to the sound of his voice, low and honest, to the way he said his wife's name, to the way he'd covered her without a word. She didn't know what to do with any of it, didn't know if it meant something or if it only felt like it did. And so she said nothing until Thursday afternoon. The office was quiet. Half the staff was out on site visits. Grace stayed late to finish paperwork for an upcoming proposal. It was muscle memory at this point: organize the files, check the budgets, polish the presentation. Efficient, controlled, safe. She opened a folder marked Whitmore Place, her housing proposal, the one that had been tabled without discussion weeks ago. She hadn't touched it since, but tonight, something in her wanted to look again, maybe to prove she could let it go, or maybe to see if she still believed in it. She clicked through the draft, scrolled through notes she barely remembered writing. Then, near the bottom, something caught her eye. A name, highlighted in blue. Her breath hitched. She stared at the screen. It couldn't be. But it was. A name she hadn't seen in years. A name she never thought she'd see again. And in a document Daniel had touched. Then, she opened an old document and saw a name that made her stomach drop. There it was, in bold letters, Prescott Holdings, on the bankruptcy report of her father's company. Grace stared at the screen, unable to blink. The name seemed to blur, then sharpen, as if daring her to doubt what she saw. The file was dated 9 years ago, filed in Illinois, and linked, unmistakably, to the acquisition of Whitmore Construction, her family's business. The business her father had built from nothing, the one he had poured his life into. She clicked, almost in a trance. Every line of the document clawed open an old wound she thought had scarred over. Prescott Holdings had acquired several construction assets that year, including small family-owned companies across the Midwest. It was a strategic expansion aimed at swallowing up regional competitors, according to the report, the kind of streamlining that investors applauded. But Grace knew what that meant. She remembered the layoff notices, the strained dinners where her father sat in silence. The night he told her he was selling the company because they had no choice, because a bigger firm had forced their hand. She'd asked for a name. He didn't give one. But now, she knew. It had been Daniel, or at least the company that bore his name. Prescott Holdings had signed the dotted line. Prescott Holdings had dismantled what her father had built. Prescott Holdings had set the fire that burned her family down. Grace felt her stomach clench as memories flooded back sharp, fast, unrelenting. The boxes in the garage, filled with decades of contracts and tools and old hard hats, her mother's trembling hands as she tried to balance hospital bills while pretending not to worry. The smell of burnt toast that lingered for weeks after her father stopped eating breakfast altogether. Grace had been 25, bright-eyed, full of plans. She'd applied for graduate school that spring. She didn't go. Instead, she moved back home, found a job, helped her parents breathe again, even if it was only for a moment. And now it all came crashing down, wrapped in a logo she'd stared at every day for 7 years. Prescott. Her hands trembled as she shut the laptop. She stood slowly, legs unsteady beneath her. The man who had kissed her in the firelight, who had shared stories of loss and quiet grief, was also the man whose empire had swallowed her family's dreams whole. She didn't know if he had made the decision himself. Maybe he hadn't even known about the specific deal. Maybe it had been one of many faceless acquisitions buried in board meetings and spreadsheets. But it didn't matter. It was his name, his legacy, and now, her truth. Grace walked out of the office in a daze. The hallways felt narrower, the lights too bright. Each face she passed blurred into a smear of noise and movement. She didn't go home. She didn't cry. She walked. Block after block, letting the city carry her through its cold, indifferent rhythm. By the time she returned to her apartment, night had already wrapped around the buildings. She sat in the dark for a long time, jacket still on, shoes still wet from the streets. There was no fire here, no Daniel, no space to speak softly and be heard, only silence. The next morning, she didn't go to work. Instead, she wrote a letter, short, simple, direct. Daniel, effective immediately. I resign from my position. Please consider this formal notice. No further explanation will be given. Grace Whitmore. She didn't sign it with warmth. Didn't end it with sincerely or regretfully or all the best, just her name. And a full stop. She printed it, folded it in thirds, slipped it into an envelope. Then she picked up her company badge, 7 years of building, solving, surviving, and walked into the office one final time. She didn't go to her desk, didn't say goodbye to anyone. She walked straight to Daniel's office, heart pounding in rhythm with her steps. He wasn't there. That made it easier. She opened the door quietly, stepped inside, and laid the envelope on his desk. Then, beside it, her badge face down, the logo hidden. No note, no message, no second look. And then she walked away, not out of anger, not entirely, but out of something deeper, a truth too heavy to carry into another day. She didn't know where she was going, not yet, but she knew this. She couldn't stay. Daniel stood at the window of his office, watching the city blink below, and wondered how silence could be louder than rage. Grace hadn't said a word, no confrontation, no accusations, just a letter and her badge. Quiet, final, irrevocable. He'd read the resignation 3 times, as if a fourth might make the words soften, give him a loophole. But there was none. It was Grace, distilled, efficient, composed, devastating. And now, her absence filled the room like fog. Daniel hadn't gone after her, not right away. Maybe he thought she'd return. Maybe he hoped it was temporary, that she needed space, that time would blunt the edge. But 2 weeks had passed. No word, no signal, not even a trace on the shared documents they used to pass between them like lifelines. So now he stood in his office, arms folded tight, watching traffic crawl under a darkening sky, and wondered if silence could, in fact, be the final word. But guilt has a way of waking old ghosts, and Daniel had plenty. He still remembered the meeting from 9 years ago, the boardroom lit with sterile light. The men in suits discussing metrics, efficiency, growth. Whitmore Construction had been circled in red. A small firm with strong land holdings and a declining cash flow. Easy to fold, easier to forget. Daniel had argued, quietly, carefully. He wasn't CEO then, just a rising VP. He said the numbers weren't the whole story, that the firm had legacy value, that its founder had an untarnished reputation in the Midwest, but no one listened. Deals were made, signatures inked, and then, as was often the case, people moved on. Except Daniel hadn't. He hadn't told anyone, not even the team, why that particular acquisition stayed with him. Why? A year later, he'd started writing anonymous checks to a certain family-run address, small amounts, spread over time, always filtered through third parties, enough to keep the lights on, maybe enough to ease the burden, never enough to erase what had been taken. He never knew if the money helped. He just couldn't live with the idea of doing nothing. And then, years later, a resume crossed his desk. Grace Whitmore. He recognized the name instantly. It was a gut punch wrapped in a beige folder, but when he interviewed her, she didn't mention her past, didn't even flinch when he introduced himself. He hoped she didn't know. And now, of course, he knew better. He left the window, grabbed his coat, and walked out. He found her at a quiet cafe near the lake, one she used to order from during late nights at the office. She always requested extra sugar packets, even though she only used one. She was sitting by the window, a mug between her hands, eyes distant. Daniel hesitated at the door. He had rehearsed the words. But now, standing there, he wasn't sure any of them mattered. Still, he walked over. She looked up as he approached. Her face didn't harden, but it didn't soften either. "May I?" he asked, motioning to the chair. A pause, then a nod. He sat down, folding his hands on the table like a man asking for penance, not permission. "I knew," she said quietly, before he could speak. About the acquisition. Daniel nodded slowly. I figured. I didn't know when I started, she added, but when I found out, everything made sense. The way you avoided my proposal, the distance, the guilt. He met her eyes, steady now. I didn't avoid your proposal. I protected it. From the same machine that destroyed your father's company. Grace blinked. What I knew, the board would tear it apart, just like before. So I kept it out of sight. Not because I didn't believe in it, but because I did. She looked away, absorbing that. Daniel took a breath. I tried to stop the deal back then, he said. I wasn't in charge yet. I didn't have the votes. I fought in the only ways I could. He paused. And afterward, I sent help. Quietly. Through channels. I didn't want credit. I just wanted to ease the damage. Grace didn't respond. Her fingers tightened around her mug. I didn't tell you, Daniel said, voice lower now, because I didn't think I deserved to. She looked at him again, really looked. And what she saw wasn't a man hiding behind power. It was a man carrying the weight of things unsaid, decisions made in rooms she'd never entered. I never asked you to forgive me, he said gently. But I never stopped hoping you might. Grace hadn't touched the old leather chair in years, but now she needed to sit in it just to remember who her father really was. The office smelled the same, dust and paper. A faint trace of cedar and machine oil still lingered in the air, the scent of years spent dreaming, building, and eventually surrendering. It had been her father's sanctuary once, the back office of a warehouse now mostly emptied of tools and life. The windows were streaked with age. The file cabinets hadn't been opened in a decade. She sat slowly, letting the worn leather creak beneath her. It had always seemed too big when she was younger, like a throne for a man who held more than just blueprints. He held hopes, his own and others. Grace traced the armrest with her fingers. There were small cracks in the leather now. Time had done what failure couldn't. A cough echoed from the hallway. Thought I heard someone come in, said a voice. She turned and saw Tom Delaney, her father's old business partner. He walked with a slower gait these days, but his eyes were sharp as ever. Hey, Tommy, Grace said softly. Well, I'll be, he said, stepping in and giving her a gentle side hug. You haven't been back here since the auction. I know, she replied. Tom glanced around the office. Still got the old chair. I needed to see it, she said, to remember. He sat across from her in the beat-up visitor chair, groaning a little as he did. After a pause, Grace spoke again. Do you remember who bought the company back then? Tom looked at her. You mean Prescott Holdings? Her stomach tightened. You knew he nodded. Yeah. We didn't talk about it much. Your dad didn't want you worrying more than you already were. Grace swallowed hard. Daniel Prescott. He says he tried to stop the deal. Tom leaned back, thoughtful. I remember him. Young guy. Quieter than the rest. Didn't push us like the others. He came down once. Met your dad in person. That startled her. He did, yup. Sat right where you're sitting now. Said he wanted to understand the place before the papers were signed. Your dad didn't say much about it afterward, but I could tell it meant something that the guy showed up. Grace felt something shift in her chest, a thread pulled loose from a memory she didn't even realize she'd buried. He said he tried to help. She added, later. Quietly. Tom nodded slowly. I wouldn't be surprised. Someone sent your dad an envelope once. No return address. Just a check inside. Enough to cover insurance premiums for 6 months. Your dad tore it up. Said he wouldn't take pity money. Grace blinked back the sting behind her eyes. Tom looked at her, kind but firm. "You know your dad, Grace. He wasn't broken by money. He was broken by silence, by not knowing if what he built meant anything to anyone." She looked around the office again. The dust had settled, but the weight hadn't. Not entirely. Tom stood slowly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "He was proud of you, even when he didn't say it, especially when he didn't." After he left, Grace stayed in the chair a while longer. She let herself remember not just the fall, but the rise. The early days, when she'd visit job sites with her father, how he'd explain blueprints like they were treasure maps, how he'd laugh at muddy boots and teach her the strength of foundations both concrete and emotional. She thought of her own path, how she'd buried herself in Daniel's world, built walls of competence and silence, how easy it had been to stop dreaming, to start surviving. And now, here she was, between two lives, one that had broken her and one she hadn't dared build yet. Grace stood slowly. She didn't take anything with her, except memory and a quiet, growing clarity. That night, she returned home and pulled out a duffel bag. Folded in 2 days' worth of clothes, her laptop, a notebook, one photo of her parents from better times, no explanations, no announcements, just a single, simple step forward. She packed one small bag and booked a ticket. She didn't expect the sign. Future site of Whitmore Place. Her name, her father's name, carved into hope. Grace pulled her coat tighter as the wind brushed over the construction site. The early spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp soil and fresh-cut lumber. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she moved closer to the wooden post with the bold blue lettering. She hadn't been ready to come before. Not when Daniel had told her about stepping down, not when he quietly mentioned the community project he was funding. But when she saw the photo again, the one of her father, tucked into an old wallet she hadn't opened in years, she knew it was time. And now, standing here, she realized this wasn't just a project. It was something more. A return, a redemption. Whitmore Place was being built in a quiet corner of the city, on land her father once hoped to buy. He'd talked about it often at the dinner table, his dream of building homes for working-class families, with front porches and trees. Not just square footage, but that dream died the day his company was swallowed up. And yet, here it was, being reborn. Rows of foundations lined the lot. Wooden frames stood tall like skeletal promises. Construction crews moved methodically, nailing and lifting and measuring. There was rhythm in the noise, a kind of forward motion. Then she saw him. Daniel stood near one of the makeshift site offices, clipboard in hand, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He looked comfortable in a way she had never seen in the office tower. His shoes were dusty, his hair a little unkempt, but there was light in his eyes. She hesitated, then walked toward him. Their eyes met before she said a word. Daniel blinked, surprised. But he didn't speak immediately. He simply studied her face, as if to confirm she was real and not a flicker of memory. "You came," he finally said, voice quiet over the wind. "I wasn't sure I would," she replied. "I wasn't sure you should." A pause hung between them. She glanced at the sign again. "You named it after him." Daniel nodded. "And you?" She raised an eyebrow. "You both tried to build something that mattered," he said. "It felt right to honor that." Grace exhaled slowly. "You left the company." "I had to," he said. "After everything. I realized I didn't want my name on boardroom walls. I wanted it on something I could stand in, walk through, leave better than I found it." She looked around. This isn't a small investment. It's most of what I had left. Her eyes flicked back to him. I don't mean financially, he added. I mean, it's all the pieces of me I never gave to anything else. Grace's throat tightened. She hadn't expected this either. The openness, the unpolished truth. I brought something, she said, reaching into her bag. She handed him an envelope, slim and slightly worn. Inside, a photo Daniel, taken from across the street on the last day he walked out of Prescott Holdings. He hadn't known she was there. She'd taken the picture through a bus window, her hand shaking. He looked stripped down, human. Daniel turned the photo over in his hands. You kept this for a while, she said. Then I forgot I had it, but I saw it again last week, and I didn't want to keep it to myself. He said nothing, just tucked the photo carefully into the inside pocket of his coat. She hesitated, then added, I saw your photo too, the one from your office. The day I left, I couldn't delete it, he admitted. She nodded. They stood side by side now, looking out over the land as the sun pushed higher, casting gold over the tops of the beams. I don't know what this is, she said softly. Us? This place? Any of it? Neither do I, he said. But I'd like to find out. She turned to him, watching his expression shift, not guarded, not pleading. Just open. And if I'm honest, he added, I think this is the first time I've ever really built something. From the heart. Grace didn't respond right away. She let the wind fill the silence. Let herself feel the earth beneath her boots, the warmth of sunlight on her cheek, the echo of her father's voice in the back of her mind. Dream big, baby girl, but build strong. She looked at Daniel not as the man who had once broken something, but as the man who was trying to rebuild. And he looked at her, not as a boss, not as a mistake, but as the only thing still standing after the fire. For a long time, neither of them spoke, and maybe that was the point. The wind rustled through the half-built frames of Whitmore Place, carrying the scent of sawdust and spring. Workers had gone home for the day. The site stood still now, like a breath held between what was and what might still be. Daniel sat on a low wooden beam, elbows on his knees, watching the sun dip below the horizon. His jacket was folded beside him. The dirt on his sleeves matched the tiredness in his posture, but something about him felt lighter, like he had finally stopped running. Grace stood for a moment longer before sitting beside him. Not too close, not far, just enough. She didn't speak. He didn't look at her. They sat like that side by side, strangers to the noise but not to each other. What needed to be said had already been spoken, or understood in silence. Grace looked around. The framing for the first homes was nearly complete. Driveways were marked, wiring half-run. There was still so much to do, but there was life here now, and intention. Daniel cleared his throat, not to speak, but just to breathe through the lump that had settled. Then, softly, he said, "Stay a while." No command, no question. Just space, offered like an open door. Grace didn't answer with words. She just leaned back slightly, letting her shoulder touch his barely. A silent yes in the form of staying put. She wasn't staying for closure. She wasn't staying for him. She was staying for herself, for the version of her that once believed in foundations and hope. The version that finally understood you can lose everything and still begin again. Daniel let the silence stretch. Then, as if reading her thoughts, he whispered, "Do you think they'd be proud of us?" She smiled softly. "I think they'd be surprised." He chuckled. "Fair. Grace thought of her father, his stubborn kindness, his big dreams, his quiet fall. She thought of how he would sit in his office chair and draw houses on napkins, just for fun, not profit, not progress, just joy. She reached into her coat and pulled out the napkin she had kept all these years. It was yellowed now, edges torn. A simple sketch of a house with a wide porch and a swing. Her father's handwriting still visible at the bottom for Grace's future. She passed it to Daniel. He took it with both hands, reverently. His eyes scanned the lines, the childlike vision. Then he looked up at the site in front of them, like matching dream to reality. "I want this one built first," he said, exactly as he drew it. Grace didn't respond. She just let the warmth in her chest settle in. No more questions. No more suspicions. All the ghosts had been named, acknowledged, and set down, even the ones they'd carried for too long. She thought of her mother, whose quiet strength held their family together in the hardest years, of Tom Delaney, who still visited the old warehouse once a week, watering a plant no longer growing, of the engagement she never mourned properly, of the years she spent in Daniel's office, too scared to speak too loudly until she finally did. And Daniel. He had shed the layers of success that never fit. The boardrooms, the cold towers, the legacy etched in numbers. He had traded it for wood and dirt and blueprints that left room for soul. He reached for something in his pocket, a key. He placed it gently in Grace's hand. "What's this?" she asked. "Office trailer," he said. "You've got a better eye than I do." She looked down at the small silver key, brushed clean of dust. "You're not asking me to come back," she said. He shook his head. "No, just to help build something that deserves your name." She smiled, not wide, but full. The last of the sun dropped beneath the skyline, turning the sky to amber. The wind softened. The sight seemed to breathe with them now. Daniel stood first, offering his hand not to pull her up, but simply to hold. She took it. They walked slowly through the site, past future kitchens and quiet front doors, past windows that would someday hold laughter, past shadows that no longer held fear. At the gate, they paused. "Thank you," she said, "for not trying to fix what broke, just for being here." Daniel met her gaze. "Some things don't need fixing, just room to grow again." She nodded, let go of his hand, then paused. "Daniel," she said, voice soft, "what if it doesn't last? Any of this?" He looked at the ground, then back at her. "Some hearts break," he said, "not to end, but to begin again, stronger. Sometimes healing doesn't come with grand gestures. It begins in silence between two people brave enough to sit with the truth." Grace and Daniel's story reminds us that the past cannot be undone, but it can be honored. We cannot change who we once were, or the pain we once caused or carried, but we can choose what we build from it. It takes great strength to walk away from something broken, but it takes even greater courage to stay and mend it. In life, many of us carry wounds that were never acknowledged, apologies that never came, and love that was never spoken aloud. Yet even after loss, betrayal, or silence, we still have the power to begin again, not by forgetting, but by forgiving, by listening, by choosing to stay when staying means rebuilding not for the past, but for a future rooted in grace. Because sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the ashes. Thank you for spending this quiet moment with us. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who needs it, and subscribing to our channel for more stories that speak to the soul. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, connect, and inspire. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself and each other.